Hey everyone, welcome to Norm's Workshop. I'm Norm, and today in the workshop we're going to be finishing up our KitchenAid Stand Mixer Restoration. Stay tuned and I'll take you through the rest of the steps. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. Finally, right? In part 1 we disassembled the mixer, and in part 2 we repainted it to give it a fresh new look. Well, here in part 3 we're going to grease, reassemble, and test it to make sure everything is working perfectly. So cross your fingers, hope we get it right, and don't forget to press that like or subscribe button. If you managed to get your mixer disassembled in part 1 and you still know where all the parts are, well then you clearly already have the skills needed to put it back together. Now it's going to take all the same tools that it did for part 1, but here's the list again. Flat blade screwdriver, number 2 Phillips, number 3 Phillips, a hammer, rubber mallet, needle nose and standard pliers, pin punch or a set of nail sets, and a plastic spatula to spread the grease. It should take about 2 hours to complete the greasing and reassembly. And, well, you should already have all the parts and grease you need ready to go. So the cost for this part should be 0. If you've got one, break out a large table and start spreading out all of the major parts. Separate them into different assembly groups, and then redistribute all the screws and hardware to make sure nothing has gone missing. Now let's take a moment to confirm that everything's matched up and everything we need is there, including any mechanical parts, the new replacement parts, and freshly painted housings. Let's dive right in with the lower housing. Place the housing right side up, and then cleanly smear some grease onto the housing where the drive shaft will sit. Always keep the grease cleanly in the area that it needs to be to avoid unnecessary cleaning. Pick up the drive shaft and hold it with the O-ring side up. Liberally grease the shaft and the side surface of the gear, but do not grease the rest of the gear yet. Insert the drive shaft grease side down into the upper housing. Go slow and turn the shaft as you go to help the O-ring slide through. Take the transmission and seat it onto the guide pins in the lower housing. Make sure the drive shaft gear and the transmission gear engage. Attach the transmission using the 3 Phillips head screws shown and firmly tighten. Check to make sure that the drive shaft gear is engaging smoothly with the transmission. Once you've done that, you can set the lower housing unit aside. If you removed the speed control lever in order to paint your surfaces, well now it's time to reinstall. I decided to replace my lever with a new one. It's part number 9709276. This part is slightly different than the original, but it fit just fine and it worked perfectly. Place the upper housing on the table upside down. Start the speed control installation with the spring. Slide the long segment of the spring with the hook through the gasket opening just above the motor. It will hook into the small hole in the back of the motor. Turn the speed control lever so that the pin faces down. Place the loop of the spring onto the pin and then push the pin down into the hole in the flat bar. Attach the speed control lever to the housing using the screw and the washer shown. You can begin the upper housing greasing by applying grease to the accessory gear shaft and the back side of the gear. Slide the shaft into place from the inside of the housing. Make sure it turns freely, as the gears will hold it in place later on. Apply a healthy layer of grease to the accessory gear teeth. Also place grease into the drive shaft socket in the gear housing. Now apply a thick layer of grease to the entire worm gear. And then set the upper unit aside. Bring the lower unit back to the table and apply a significant amount of grease to all the gear teeth and moving components of the transmission and drive shaft. Rotate the gears as you go to make sure there's grease on everything. Don't spare the grease in this process. During use, a lot of the grease in the housing gets thrown outward and clings to the walls. You want to make sure that enough grease remains on the gears to properly lubricate them. Place some grease on the upper portion of the drive shaft and onto the end as well. This is going to fit into a socket in the upper housing when we assemble the two parts together. At this point, you should only have 1/2 to 1 ounce of grease left in the jar for use later on. Place the upper housing upside down on the table, and then place the lower housing gear side up right next to it. Set the gasket onto the lower housing, locating it correctly. There's a narrow section of the gasket that goes next to the transmission. Now join the upper and lower housings together. Make sure that the gasket remains properly positioned throughout the whole process. Slowly rotate the drive shaft using the pin punch or a nail set until all the gears mesh together properly. The housing should now be seated correctly and have only a small gap between them. Hand attach all the housing screws to the housing. Remember, there's 2 long screws in the back, 2 shorter screws in the middle, and 5 screws that go around the drive shaft. Once they're hand tightened, we can now use a screwdriver to bring those 2 housing parts together. All of the housing screws should now be attached, and the upper and lower housing should be perfectly sealed together. Now go back and retighten all of those screws. They're all going to be hidden during final assembly, and this is the last chance we'll get to have them tight. We saved 1/2 to 1 ounce of grease, and now it's time to use it. Liberally grease the planetary gear teeth on the assembled mixer head. Place the 2 fiber washers onto the drive shaft, and then lightly grease the shaft from the O-ring down to the washers. Now grease the inside of the planetary housing, but avoid getting grease onto the outer housing. Carefully attach the planetary housing to the mixer head. Rotate and push the planetary housing to make sure the gears mesh and the O-ring slides into the shaft and seals properly. Clean off any grease that oozes out onto the outer surfaces. The shaft pin hole in the housing needs to line up to a hole in the shafts so that the pin can be driven through into place. But it really isn't that easy. Rotate the planetary housing until you can see the hole in the shaft. It's very likely that the holes will not line up perfectly. Once you can see the hole, you can now use a small screwdriver, a nail set, or other pointed tool to reach into the hole and wiggle the shaft to perfectly align it with the planetary. When complete, the shaft should be flush with the bottom of the planetary housing. Place the shaft pin into the planetary. You may want to protect the housing area around the shaft with a little masking tape or cloth in case you slip when driving the pin. Using the pin punch or the nail set, slowly drive the pin into the housing until it's flush on both sides. Pull out the freshly cleaned power cord. Find the electrical terminals at the back of the mixer head behind the motor. Attach the wires to the same terminals you removed them from originally. Our mixer had the white wire on the first terminal and the black wire on the second terminal. Seat the electrical cord and the cord grommet into the hole at the back of the mixer head. The mixer head is now assembled enough to test the motor function. Lay the mixer head on its side with the speed control lever facing up. Plug the mixer into the wall outlet and then slide the speed control lever to start the mixer slowly at first, which will help seat the gears and work the grease into all the places it needs to go. Our mixer was loud at first, but gradually smoothed out as the grease worked its way in. Our old drip ring looked pretty bad, so we decided to replace it with a brand new shiny one. The drip ring is part number 240285. Place the mixer head with the planetary side up. The drip ring is a pressure fit part. Try to press it in place by hand and then lightly tap it with a rubber mallet until it is completely seated in place. Be extra careful not to damage the newly painted surfaces. We chose to replace the bowl clip that attaches to the bowl lift. This is KitchenAid part number 3182857. Now the KitchenAid baggie calls it a spring, but the invoice called it a latch, and we just call it a bowl clip. The new bowl clip is slightly different than the original, but it did fit in place and it works just fine. The bowl clip attaches to the bowl lift using the two short pan head screws. Tighten both of the screws. Slide the bowl lift onto the stand tower. The bowl lift attaches using two short flathead screws. Reach into the stand tower and hold the lift mount up against the back of the bowl lift while hand starting the screws. Once started, tighten both screws securely. Place the stand tower right side up and test the bowl lift function to make sure it's smooth and locks in place at the top. The next few clips mistakenly show the rear cap already installed. The cap should not yet be on the housing. It's not really a problem if you've installed it like we did, but it will need to be removed and then reinstalled again. Place the mixer head on the table planetary side up. Line up the tower stand to the positioning pins and fit the two units together. Lay the unit on its side and attach together using 4 large number 3 Phillips head screws, and then tighten all 4 screws firmly to complete. Place the mixer head and the tower assembly on its side. Line up the stand base to the 4 screw holes. Attach the base to the tower using the 4 large Phillips head screws. Hand tighten all 4 screws and then tighten securely using the number 3 Phillips head screwdriver. Now stand the mixer upright. Step back and take a deep breath. You're almost done and it's starting to look really good. But no stopping now. We purchased a new trim band because the old one looked really bad. Like the other parts we purchased, this trim band didn't exactly match the old one, but it did fit just fine and it looks really nice. The trim band part number is W11230105. Fit the band into the recessed area around the mixer head. Move the speed control lever away from the off position. This will help the band to fit around the control and seat into place. Once the band is seated in place, you can move the speed control lever back to off. Push the rear tabs into place, lining the holes up in the housing. Attach using the 2 tiny Phillips head screws. The trim band is now attached so we can truly install the rear cap. Tilt the bottom of the cap into place so that the 2 hooks catch the housing. Slide the cap down slightly and then inward at the top to line up the screw hole. Attach the single Phillips head screw at the top center of the cap. Now it's time to put some lipstick on this thing. We purchased a new KitchenAid logo accessory cap to really make this mixer look new. The cap part number is W11048596. The original cap was just a plain boring pressure fit cap. The new cap is a chrome cast part complete with the KitchenAid logo. It attaches simply by tightening the attachment thumb screw. Well, if you did everything right, you should have no parts left to install and there should be no screws or hardware in the magnetic tray. The project is now complete. And if you do have any parts, screws, or hardware left over, well, just rewatch all the videos and then go back and start the project all over again. The links to all 3 parts are in the description below. Well, there's nothing left to do now but put a fresh coat of wax on it. If you like this video, please hit the like or subscribe buttons. And until next time, thanks for watching Norm's Workshop.